Labor Day is here. Where did the summer go? But I'm thankful for the fall. Amen? We have been going through a series on Nehemiah, and we've gone verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and now we're at the close of it. And they've been in the midst of a revival, and now we're going to find out what happens after the revival. Have you ever gone to see a movie and it just had a great ending? And you thought, oh, that's terrific. Have you ever gone to see a movie and thought, that really was bad ending? Unfortunately, Nehemiah seems to be that way. Just when you think everything was going great and you get to the end of it and you think, what happened? I want to put this a little bit in context for you. In the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament, the 39 books, are arranged in different kinds of ways. It's not all chronological. If you wanted to follow the storyline, the narrative story of what happened from Adam till the time of Jesus, you would follow basically these 11 books in the Old Testament. Genesis, and the last one's Nehemiah. Now, I know that that's not the last book in the Old Testament. That's Malachi, but Malachi actually takes place during the time of Ezra. But the narrative story of the Old Testament ends with the people coming back from their 70 years of being in Babylon back into Israel. They rebuild the walls in Jerusalem, and we're in that time period. And after this time period, which is described in this book of Nehemiah, there are 400 years of silence, and then Jesus comes. And so this is important to know what's going on at the beginning or at the ending of the Old Testament. And we're in Nehemiah chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Now, before I start here, I just want to talk about for a second what happened in chapter 11 and 12. In chapter 11, they decide who gets to live in the city of Jerusalem after they rebuild the walls. 1/10 of the people, they take there's a lottery, and 10% of the people get to live there. And chapter 11 is naming who lives there. And I'm not going to try to read all those names. I can't pronounce them. Chapter 12 lists the names of the Levites and some of the other people. Very hard to pronounce. End of chapter 12, there's a big celebration about the completion of the walls and people coming to live there. And they have 2 choirs that go up on the walls themselves, walk around on the walls, and they have this big celebration. And you think that's the way it should end. But then you have chapter 13. On that day, the book of the Moses this is the Torah. We sometimes call it the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, was read aloud in the hearing of the people. And there was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted to the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Now, it's possible. Some of you know this story. Some of you don't. And so I want to review it for those of us that we need a little refresher course of what was going on. The people of Israel wandered for 40 years in the desert because they didn't have faith to go take the city of Jerusalem. They listened to the 10 bad spies and instead of Joshua and Caleb, and so they had to wander for 40 years. They are finally to the point now where they're going to go back into their promised land. And they first meet the kingdom of Ammon, and they are able to defeat an army in battle. And now they ask for permission to travel through Moab. By the way, Abraham had a nephew named Lot. The descendants of Lot were the Ammonites and the Moabites. This is where they come from. And so they wanted to travel through Moab, and they asked for permission, and the people did not give them permission. In fact, the king of Moab hires this guy who's a prophet to come and say a negative prophecy against them. And so this is what this is referring to. It's referring to Deuteronomy 23, which I've got that verse up. No Ammonite nor Moabite or any of the descendants of them may enter the assembly of the Lord for 10 generations even. For they did not come to meet you with bread or water on your way when you came out of Egypt. They didn't welcome you. In fact, they hired Balaam son of Bor, from Pethor and Aram and Neharaim, to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. Now, this is the story that some of you may remember about the donkey. Remember that story? And what's the news about this donkey? He talks, okay? Now, because it's unusual, I'll look at it, because it's part of the Bible, we forget it. Numbers 22. So let me set the frame for you here. So there's this guy named Balaam, and he's a prophet. He's not a prophet of Israel, but he's a prophet of God that listens to God. The king of Moab hires him and say, listen, we're going to pay you some money if you'll say a curse on the people of Israel. So Balaam says, well, let me pray about it. And so he spends the night, he prays about it. In his prayer, God says, never curse the children of Israel. They're my people. He wakes up the next morning, he says, sorry guys, can't do it. God said no. That delegation goes back to their king, Balak, and Balak says, offer him more money. So he goes back, and he offers Balaam a lot of money. Balaam listens to the offer and says, let me think about it. And he goes back and he prays again. And he kind of asks God if he can go there. And so God said, okay, I'll let you go there, but don't say anything that I don't tell you to say. So, verse 21 in Numbers, Balaam got up in the morning after praying with God, saddled his donkey, and went with the Moabite officials. But God was very angry when he went, and the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose him, but he couldn't see it. And Balaam was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with a drawn sword, the donkey turned off the road into a field, and Balaam beat it to get it back on the road. It's kind of a comedy, isn't it? The angel of the Lord stood in a narrow path second time through the vineyards with walls on both sides. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it pressed close to the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against it. It hurt. So he beat the donkey again. Third time, the angel of the Lord moved on ahead and stood directly in front of a narrow place where there's no room to turn, either to right or to left. So what did that donkey do? The donkey just laid down. He saw the angel of the Lord. It lay down under Balaam, and Balaam was very angry and beat it with his staff. Now, when the unusual part happens, and you might ask me, how can a donkey talk? It's called a miracle. The Bible's filled with miracles. And so the Lord opened the donkey's mouth. Now, I would have thought if I was Balaam, what do you mean you're talking? You know, I would have been really surprised, but he seems to like take it under his wing. And he said to Balaam, the donkey did, what have I done to make you beat me these 3 times? He asked that. And Balaam answered the donkey, you have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I'd kill you right now. Balaam says to the donkey. The donkey said to Balaam, am I not your own donkey which you've ridden to this day? And have I been in the habit of doing this to you? And he says, no. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he sees this angel that's standing in the road with his sword down. And so the donkey is shown to be smarter than Balaam. So he bowed down low, and he fell face down. Balaam did. And this is the story of how God turned this idea of a blessing into a curse, which goes back to the Nehemiah story. Said even though they wanted Naaman to curse the people of Israel, God turned the curse into a blessing. Have you ever had something bad happen to you that turned out to be a blessing? Sharon has told this story few times to me and to other people, that when she was she graduated college and wanted to go to graduate school, and she had a counselor there at the college. And the counselor knew Sharon and her family. The counselor knew that she had 7 brothers and sisters. She knew that her father worked at the Ford Glass Company and that they didn't have a lot of money. And so she did not say that she could get in this graduate school. She did not send the paperwork that Sharon asked her to send. And so it seemed like it was like she was cursing Sharon But Sharon is a persistent person. Some of y'all know Sharon. So she kicked the door somewhat, and she got into a different graduate school, which then let her go into seminary, which is where I met her. And I wouldn't have met her if she hadn't gone to Southern Seminary and she hadn't had that person that tried to do something bad to her. And so I know it was a blessing that she got to meet me. And so at least that's what she says. Somewhat. But there's going to be times in your life and my life when things bad happen and you think, wow, that was terrible that happened. But God can use it to bless you. I've seen it happen, and it can happen, and it still happens. So this experience, when they tried to get Naaman to curse them, turned out to be a blessing for them. But they respond to it in chapter 13 in a way that, if you look at the text carefully, I think is kind of legalistic. Legalism is alive and well. And so when they discovered the command for having this Old Testament read out loud, that the Ammonites and the Moabites should not come in the assembly of Israel, in verse 3 it says, when the people heard this, they excluded from Israel anybody of foreign descent. We don't want nobody who's not Jewish in their history. Is that what the commandment was? No, the commandment was with these two groups of people because of the way they treated the Israelites. But they kind of made it for everybody. And so they had this tendency to go overboard, which sometimes people do with rules and regulations. And this is what happened. By the way, if you remember the story of Ruth, anybody remember what Ruth was? What kind of nationality she was? She was a Moabite. So God can use anybody. It doesn't matter their ancestry. But the second thing these people did in chapter 13 is called nepotism. Now, you know what nepotism is. Nepotism is favoritism to people in your family. It's like if you were a boss and you saw many people who are good applicants, instead you got your ne'er-do-well son-in-law. You gave him the job. It was special treatment of your family, and this is what was going on in chapter 13. Before this, Elisha, the priest, one of the priests, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of the temple. So in the temple, they had these big storerooms that had all kinds of things, which, by the way, reminds me of the verse where Jesus said in John 14, in my Father's house are many what? Rooms. Rooms is actually the translation. It's probably talk about these storerooms, that things are treasured up for us in heaven that he's going to reveal to us and bless you with. So in this temple, they had these storerooms. But this Elisha the priest was closely associated with a man named Tobiah. Now, when it says closely associated, that's a Hebrew euphemism that means he was related by family. One of his daughters probably married Tobiah. Was Tobiah a good guy or bad guy? Bad guy. Earlier in the book of Nehemiah, when they were building the walls, Tobiah complained about them. He said, listen, even if a fox jumped up on that wall, it would fall over. Well, when they finished, the walls were 9 feet wide and 30 feet high. In fact, 2 choirs walked around on that. Must have been a pretty hefty fox to knock over that wall. So Tobiah was an evil guy. He was an Ammonite. But they had brought him in they made a suite for him in the temple, which you're not supposed to do that. It says in verse 5, they provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and the incense and the temple articles, all the things that make church happen. And also the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil, which was supposed to be given to the Levites so that they could take care of the temple, and the musicians, the gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priest. And so not only did it take out all that let somebody live in the temple, it didn't provide room for these supplies that they needed. Now, how did this happen? Well, it happened because Nehemiah had not been in town. You see, Nehemiah, if you count it up, was in Jerusalem for 12 years. 12 years that he did his ministry there. And then the king of Artaxerxes ask him to come back. And so he went back to the king, and while he was back at the king, it all fell apart. It says, verse 6, while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked for his permission to come back to Jerusalem, and here I learned about the evil that Elisha had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the household of God. You know, this happens if you show special favoritism to people just because they're in your family. You can hurt the fellowship of any organization, but especially the church. Imagine if you had, for example, maybe it was one of your sisters that wanted to sing on the praise team, and she had a great voice, and she's a wonderful person. She's an atheist. She doesn't believe in God at all. You say, well, yeah, let her sing. She'll be great. She'll be singing. But, you know, she's not worshiping the Lord when she sings, and so it's not a good idea. But because she's related to you and everybody wants to please everybody, it happens. This is what happened with Tobiah. They let him into the house of God. Well, Nehemiah wasn't going to let stuff just stand, and so it says he was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Sharon and I used to live with our family in Chesapeake in a little neighborhood. We had a house that was next to us. One day I came home from work, and the wife of this guy was throwing all of his clothes out the upstairs window. I'm not kidding. She was throwing his clothes. I don't know what he did, but it was not good. And I said, Sharon, let's do something with the kids. And so we took their 3 kids and our 3 kids, and we took them to get ice cream. And they're still married today. That's the good news. I'm sure he deserved it. So they came back. Tobias got all this stuff in there, and so Nehemiah throws it out. Then he gave orders to purify it, clean it up. And he put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and the incense. And so he puts everything back. Can you imagine leaving after serving a church somewhere and coming back and it just being a mess? I have a friend, John Robertson, who pastors in the Eastern Shore. He used to pastor in a church well, I'm not going to tell you where, but he was able to move that church, make many improvements in the church, and he said a year after he left, all those improvements were gone. They'd gone back to the way they were before. All the things that they'd done, gone back before. This is what happened to Nehemiah. They had made these commitments, and he comes back, and now they're just not worshiping like they're supposed to. They're not doing anything. There became a rise of what you might call profit over purity, because one of the commandments that they had signed on that document in chapter 10 that they would not do is to honor the Sabbath. Well, they quit doing that. It says in verse 15, in those days I saw people of Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, making wine, and bringing in grain and loading on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they're bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. And I warned them against selling food on that day. It's ironic that one of the only businesses I see that honor that today just rebuilt their building. Why? Because they're so successful. And they're closed today, aren't they? Chick-fil-A. And may God bless them for keeping that day separate. People from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish. And they were all kinds of merchandise. They were selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. Why? To make money. Nehemiah, being the laid-back guy he is, rebuked the nobles and said to them, what is this wicked thing you're doing, desecrating the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same thing so that our God brought all this calamity on this and on this city? Now you're stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath. And when evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered all the doors to be shut. So Friday night, he said, we're shutting all the doors. And he kept them shut until Saturday night. Nobody could go in, nobody could go out, no selling, no doing that. And he stationed some of his men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. And you know how people like to push it. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. So I went outside and I warned them. I said, why do you spend the night by the wall? He warned them not to do that. And he said, if you do this again, I'll arrest you. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. He didn't let it go. And then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. And then he says this refrain, remember me for this also my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. And so he's dealing with these problems within the church after he left. Next problem, mixed marriages. Now the problem here is not racial. It's not that they were one race and they didn't like other races and they didn't want to get married between races. That's not what the problem was. The problem was marriage between people who believed God and people who followed other gods. And in verse 23, it says, moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. So they didn't even know how to understand the Torah, the Bible. They couldn't even speak the language. And so, that's not a good deal. This happened before, by the way, in the Old Testament. Remember Solomon? Solomon had lots of women issues. He had lots of wives, and many of those wives were not from a Jewish background, and so he built temples in Jerusalem to these foreign women's gods to please his wives. And it was a beginning of a real mess. And so Nehemiah didn't want this to happen. And so he, in verse 25, he said, I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. Don't you wish you lived in that church? A preacher get fired for that kind of behavior, beating people and pulling out their hair. But he has passion about following the Lord. And so he was very aggressive in that. He said, I beat some of them. I pulled out their hair. I made them take another oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or yourselves. Interesting aside here. If you read in the book of Revelation, I don't have that verse on the screen, but there's a verse in Revelation that talks about Balaam. Remember Balaam and his donkey? He does not curse the people of Israel, but he gives advice to the Moabites on how they can beat them. And you know what he says? He says, listen, guys, the best way to beat them is with your pretty women. Hang out with them. Let your women meet their guys, and before you know it, they'll all get married together, and you'll have no problems with them. You'll just kind of take them over. And so that was the plan, and Nehemiah probably knew about this, and so he says, you cannot do this. And he says in verse 26, was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations there were no king like him. He was loved by God, he had it all, and yet God made him king over all of Israel, but even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? And he gives an example of it. One of the high priest, one of the sons of Joadiah, son of Lishib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat, the Horonite, one of their worst opponents. Nehemiah says, I drove him away from me. And then he says again, remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites, and I purified the priest and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and first fruits. And then the last verse, remember me with favor, my God. Now, the whole chapter is kind of anticlimactic. They'd had this great revival. It seemed like everybody was on the same page. It fell apart. My whole career, my whole life, I've always dreamed of having great revival. I've always wanted to be, I still pray for it. regularly, every day for revival. But you know, you can even have that. You can even have revival, and before you know it, it falls apart because we're all human beings. We all have weaknesses. And if you study the history of revivals, you know, in the First Great Awakening, it was in New England, and the guy that was like one of the movers of shakers of it um, wrote a book about how it was being mishandled. Jonathan Edwards wrote a whole book about how the revival was being mishandled 5 years after it happened. Then in the Second Great Awakening, in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, which is in the hills of Kentucky, and they had this great revival. It was tent meetings in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. Do you know historians discovered that after this revival happened, there was a huge rise in unwed pregnancies in this community? And you might think, wow, that happened at a time of revival? There's no perfect person. There's no perfect community. And here they had this group of people that had this revival. They rebuilt the walls, had a celebration, had a big party, you know, music, food, and then within just a few years later, it all fell apart. I guess what I look at this and learn out of this is there's something to be said about tremendous experiences of revival. There's also something to be said about every day living out your faith and being steady, being a person who continues day after day trying to follow the Lord, asking for his guidance. And, you know, that's what we really need to have in our lives. And as I look at the close of this story and I think about the ups and downs that the children of Israel had, I am so thankful that Jesus Christ came that can provide us the hope that we so desperately need. Jesus came to give us the Holy Spirit that gives us the ability to live according to what the Bible teaches. And I pray that on a daily basis, we can model that kind of faith out. It may not be as entertaining as some of these revivals that we hear about, but God moves in quiet, small ways just as well.